So welcome everybody to this webinar where we are meeting the team assists for the Mauritius ACMC September 2015. And so welcome all of those that are there. At this stage, it's only Dirk Lee and myself, but as you're coming in, it's, please just join us. This is going to be a discussion, an open discussion, so team leaders can participate as much as they can. And officially, Dirk, who has prepared a presentation, will go through the points. Primarily, the purpose of this particular meeting is to discuss the benchmarking and a little bit of a pre-training that we will be covering on the 2 days with Michael. So I'm going to officially hand over to Dirk. So Dirk, please do your thing and share with us your presentation.
Thank you, Sandra, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are when you listen to this. To all of you that I've met before, pleased to see you again, and those of you that I haven't met before, great to meet you, and I'll see you next week in Mauritius. Sandra, thank you for setting this up. I think this is such an important discussion, and I think we've scheduled 90 minutes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some thoughts that I've prepared, and much of it might be familiar to you, but the purpose really is to get a discussion going. So at any point in time, if anybody wants to say something, please do so. If you have specific questions, type them up. So if one then say, what is the plan for today? Let me just get the system going. Sandra, you've given it back to me as presenter, right? I suddenly find that I can't actually move my... You guys there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, there we go. So the agenda then, I want to start off just talking a little bit about the approach to benchmarking, and that's a few frames, key considerations in that regard. And what I usually start off with when we talk about benchmarking is to say that for me, benchmarking really is a process with basically four steps. You have to observe certain behavior, then you have to note it down somewhere. As you do that, you actually classify at the same time. So you hear the person say to the client something like, I hear that you've just said, Now, as soon as that happens, in your mind, you have an idea that, hey, this person is busy with an acknowledgement. You write that down under the specific heading where it fits, which means you classify it. And then when you've got enough evidence recorded, then you evaluate it and you say, if I compare all this information to the standard that has been set, here is a score that I can allocate to that. And key to all of this is that you have to actually know what the sub-skills are, and you have to know what the criteria are that we use to decide what the specific score would be that you would link to that. And for today, that really is the focus. And Sandra, that's how I understood the brief. The guide to the discussion is set up in such a way that we can also, if there's enough time left, we can take some examples of potential documents that we can actually then say, if the scores look like this on the benchmarking sheet, what would the result be? What would be the evaluation? And I'm glad to see Paul and Raquel that you've also joined us. Welcome. This is really just the beginning of the discussion. So at this point in time, what I might want to also say is because the scoring examples, my guesstimate is we won't have time to deal with all the different sub-skills and skills. So if you have any specific ones that you want us to practice on, should we have some time, you can actually just put it in under the chat space on the GoToMeeting and say, if we have to choose, you would rather that we discuss, for example, state induction when we get to the practical part of this, rather than, for example, receiving feedback. So you can begin to nominate what you want, and you might also just want to get a pen and a piece of paper because you might want to do some scribblings when we get to that part, which is really sort of with the last half an hour left. So if we start off and we say, what are key considerations for benchmarking? The way I look at benchmarking is that benchmarking for me is all about the development of a coach. So my frame is that benchmarking is about giving developmental feedback and giving guidance, ideas, options for developmental planning. And the feedback and the planning influences each other. The coach plans what they want to do, they go try it out, they get feedback. In the feedback, there might be more information, they might have to plan additional tasks, or they might actually get feedback that what they have planned worked. So benchmarking for me is all about developmental planning and developmental feedback. But it is also based on a modeled and standardized skill set. And that's often something that people, they ask, why does the benchmarking form change so much? And it's really because it's based on modeled behavior. And as specifically Michael, because he does most of the ACMCs, as he picks up new subsets of skills, and if he finds that some of them actually hold together in different formats, then the form changes. So this form is continuously updated to reflect best practice in terms of meta-coaching. Now, often when we think about benchmarking, we just think the numbers. And if you read the documents the document that has come out with the team leader manual, there's emphasis on the fact that it's not just the numbers that are important, it's also the qualitative components. And as we go through some of the benchmarks, we will deal with that. Now this picture gives you an indication of what we mean when we talk about quantitative and what we mean when we talk about qualitative. But I'm sure you all know that. For me, it's almost like saying that there's the mathematical part, there's the numbers part, which is the quantitative one, the more objective one that you can generalize. And then there's the more subjective one that adds that opportunity for you to apply your judgment in terms of how all the skills that you observe hold together and hang together. Now, if you do that, just remember, and this is I'm saying that more to myself than to anybody else, that it is actually also very important that one have a consistency in how you do benchmarking. Whether it's consistency in terms of one person to the next person that you benchmark, or the same person from one session to the next session, or whether it is between me and the other benchmarkers that are part of this ACMC, so that the coaches experience feedback that they can relate to in terms of how they behave, rather than who's the person that sit with them in the session and provide that feedback to them. But I'm sure you all know that. The other point that in terms of the considerations is important to me is that one should think about the skills and sub-skills as to a very large extent overlapping and related to each other. Now, that does not say that you take one piece of evidence and you write it down under all the different skills, but it does say that there's some internal consistency because we deal with integrated skills and we deal with a systemic approach to human behavior. Examples of overlapping, you might actually write down a piece of evidence about, for example, clarity questions. Now, that would go under questions, but it would also go under listening. So you have a piece of evidence that you can decide where does it fit best. You will see from Michael's notes that when you look at the overall set of evidence that you've got for listening, that you might want to take into account inadequate questions from questioning, because if the questions were inadequate, it also gives you an indication about the listening. And that's how these sub-skills overlap, and I've used some examples. They're also related. So if you find that your scores, for example, for supporting and listening are more than 0.5 apart from each other, then you have to look again, because it's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And you might find that you've been let me say, too lenient in one case, or you might have been too strict in another case. You might also find that the related questions are questions themselves. So as you ask questions and meta questions, they might trigger some states, and as we come to state induction, you'll see that states that are just triggered by questions and no gestures or using of voice by the coach, they count in any event. 0.1 for each of those states, usually those ones on the right-hand side that you can tick off. And that says that these different skills are not discrete, separate skills. They are skills that are related and overlapping. And that closes for me just the frames that I want to start off with, saying that what we are going to do when we do benchmarking is primarily assist the coaches with development. We will, in addition to just give them feedback around the numbers, we'll also give them feedback in terms of what we, excuse me, what we noticed in terms of the qualitative components of that, and we will work with skills that are in fact systemically integrated. So the next section then deals with the sub-skills specifically, and then the criteria. And as I said in the introduction right up front, is you might know this information. In fact, you will know most of this. And I'm not attempting here to give detail because firstly, we haven't got the time for that. And I think there's enough documentation that we can read through. But please, if there are any questions, I'll really appreciate that. If you've had time to read the summary document or the guideline that Sandra sent out to you, and on that you also find that there are some inconsistencies or there are some information that based on what you know does not make sense, please let me know. That's a living document. We would like to update that. So having said that, let's start with supporting. And what I'll do here is just talk through each of the different skills by sharing what Michael wrote in the SysTeam manual, because that's really the document that we will use Monday and Tuesday, or Tuesday and Wednesday when we get our training. And on each of these slides, you'll also see a picture of the specific piece from the benchmarking form. If you pick up anything there that you have questions on, you're more than welcome to ask. The next slide for each of the different skill sets will then say, how do I approach the scoring for that specific skill set? And I think it's aligned with everything that has been written. If it is not, please point that out to me as well. So for supporting what Michael says, for 2.5, the coach has to have 1 mark for the level 3 skills that is on the benchmarking forms. And the level 3 skills are the skills that has been highlighted there or shown to you with the spotlight. So 1 of those for every minute that the coaching session takes place. And then the next sentence says approximately. And that brings in the point that I've made just now, because the quality of what the coach does might influence it. If it is of high quality, 1 might count for 2. and I'm thinking specifically of the higher level skills such as challenging, setting frames or summaries, but it holds for all these different skills. And secondly, if it is in fact of a lack of quality, then even if there is 25, it might not be enough for a 2.5 mark. That's the first point, that it's not just counting, it's also understanding, if you do count, how it in fact influences the overall process of the coaching. And then there's another paragraph that says that there must also be general rapport as well as these 25 questions or 25 behaviors. So one often asks, are the rapport components part of the level 3 skills? It doesn't really matter how you see it. It says that you have to have those, and you have to have 25 tick marks, if you can put it like that, and together they would in fact give you the necessary evidence to say that this person is reaching benchmarks on supporting. The text box that you see on the left-hand side of the next slide comes directly from the guideline document. So in the guideline document, the approach is to, with each of the skills, highlight what is that specific evidence that you look for a 2.5. The approach for scoring supporting, I think, is one of the easier ones in terms of the ACMC. You really start with nothing and you begin to add up. So for every tick that the person gets, it means they have got, for a 25-minute session, they actually have 1 point. And as you progress with that and you end up eventually with 25 points, it means that they have a 2.5 score, provided that nothing takes away from the score, because everything that is below the 2.5 implies that that's taken away again from the benchmark score. Often when we do internal coach training, what we point out to people is that to say to them that when you look at supporting, and you as the coach wants to improve on your score on supporting, what are you really looking for to focus on? Because what we find is there's often a lot of focus on matching, and they would be very particular in terms of how they sit and specifically how they sit and the hand gestures. But if you look at that, and this is not coming from any manual, it's really just a view from my side. If you start off with just the matching points, there's basically 5 ticks that you can get for that. That's matching posture, voice tempo, voice tone, as well as voice volume, and then energy. If you start off with framing the session and you provide 2 or 3 frames, well-motivated frames, that gives you another 3 points. If you then, in the whole coaching session, have about 15 acknowledgements, it brings you closer to 2.5. You're at 2.2, 2.3, provided that you do not have behavior that takes away from that. And you add to that then semantically loaded hand gestures. And obviously in this case, those that are repeated and not those that are missed. So if you look at that configuration, and that somehow makes sense to you as well, it's probably more important that coaches that are beginning with ACMC focus more on acknowledgements than on those other areas, and then add to that the other level 3 behaviors that are in the benchmarking form, that can just take the process of taking the client to the outcomes to a different level. So that's supporting. I don't know if there's any input or questions around supporting.
Dirk?
Yes, is that Lee?
I wonder if you can maybe just clarify the one area of supporting which is holding the frame.
Okay. Would you like to?
In what that actually means, so maybe you can clarify that.
Would you like to tell us what it means for you?
No, I'd like to hear what you believe it means for you.
No, man, this was now a very good facilitative question. Now, you can't do that and throw it back to me. Okay, so let me give you my view, and then you tell me if you agree, or whether you want to add something.
Okay.
Holding the frame, my understanding is that what you start off with is you set frames. And one of the pre-frames that I often hear in ACMCs is that I may interrupt you because I am not really going for the content, I'm going for structure. And at that point in time, I might have enough content, and therefore I will interrupt you because we can then move on. Now that's setting the frame. If during the coaching discussion, the person then does go on and on and on, the client that is, with specific content, then holding the frame for me would be when the coach then says, you know, as I said in the beginning, I may interrupt you. This is now at that point. So I'm going to interrupt you now and ask you that we move on to the next topic, or that you actually focus more on this question, or whatever the resultant response from the coach then is. But it's, for me, it's you set the frame and then you hold the frame. And that's one example of holding frames that you've set yourself at the start of the coaching session. Another example is holding the outcome frame. And that implies that if you really focus this coaching session of yours on a specific outcome, it implies that you also have to bring the coachee or the client back to a discussion around outcomes if they begin to deviate from that, which might in practice be similar to what I've explained initially, but it is another example of holding the frame. Can I check with you if that makes sense, Lee?
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. So I like what you said there when you said, so as I said previously, or as I said at the beginning of the session, that's always a useful way to check that the frame was held. Yeah. So I like what you said there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody that wants to add anything to the holding the frame discussion? Because I'm sure there's expertise here that can assist. If nothing for now, park the question for later. Listening.
Dirk, sorry, before
yes.
we move on to listening, just a quick question, just in terms of that little comment there that says 1 level 3 per minute, depending, will Michael's sessions, will they normally are always 25 minutes, hey? Just to verify that, because sometimes I think
yes,
we may chop it to 20.
All of them are 25 except one day.
Okay, which is day 5.
Yeah, I can't remember which day, but there's one day when it's 35 minutes. So in your mind, you just have to make the switch, but it still is relatively easy to calculate because it means that you're just looking for 35 tick marks rather than 25.
That's it.
The challenge is if it's less than that, because as soon as it becomes less than that, then you have to apply some sort of a logic in your mind to say, what is it then if I get 29? And it's good to have a little conversion table. I haven't got one of those.
Then another, sorry, that answers my question. Another quick question on semantic matches. Just to verify, that will mean both where the coach will match a semantic gesture which the coachee has done, as well, or put words, because I know there's also one words where they might not match it, but they can just verbalize what they've seen. Or am I correct in also saying that sometimes the coach themselves will use a very good semantic gesture? In other words, you know, there's a big difference between just gesturing and semantic gesturing when the coach, as a coach, saying words like meta and things like that. Would you count that as well as or only matches?
So if you look at earlier benchmarking forms, I can't remember exactly what was the heading there. Let me just go back to this one here. Currently, you will see that it really refers here now to gestures and hands. So my take on that is, and we might want to check that with Michael, my take on that is that the one component where matching is very evident is when, and semantic matching becomes very, I want to put it in inverted commas, easy, is when people use their hands in a certain way. So for me, the focus would be on hands and how the client uses his or her hands to express meaning around certain verbalizations, as well as how they give me as the coach a clue of how they structure their semantic space. In other words, if they point towards their future in a specific way, they point towards their past in another way. So that for me is the gestures that I would look for, and as per the benchmarking guidelines, if it is semantically loaded and the coach does not pick up on that, you jot that down, and that actually results in a message that says if you do not link to that, you will lose certain points. Similarly, if they do pick it up, then you tick it off that it has been done. Now, to go beyond that, there are other semantic type matches, as you've said, which goes to words. And if you go just and have a look here, it talks here to semantic matches to words. And that would be where you have got a specific tonality, and this is how I interpret that, where I say, I've been so happy. No, that is a, I hope it sounded happy, but that's the tone match. And if I match that as well, it also means that I matches that. I don't see the introduction of semantic gestures by the coach as that important.
Okay.
So if I create a space for past and I create a space for future, I would be careful to do that. I don't know whether I've interpreted your question correctly. I would really rather check with the client where he or she is at, because from my perspective, that's really what is important.
Okay, no, I think
that's my personal approach.
Yeah, I think I tend to voice that as well. My last question on supporting would, and I apologize if you did mention it, is the actual, for me, that's been very helpful when we're looking at the calculating, obviously, all the ones and then adding up to 25, is the posture, voice, volume, and that you actually do the 4 to 7, the 6 to 8, you know, or to actually verify that, because I think that's quite important, hey?
Yep.
Did you mention it already? Sorry if you did.
No, I agree with you.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. That's all my questions for supporting.
Good. Thanks for supporting me.
Okay.
So then next one, listening. The highlighted area there says that listening is the key skill in coaching. Where there's little to no listening to the client, there can be no effective use of supporting, questioning, feedback, induction, framing, and you can add other skills to this. And I think at least one of the people on the line now will know that framing is definitely another skill set, but it's not at ACMC level, that's at PCMC level. But it even then says that without listening, none of these skill sets are really served appropriately. So in terms of just thinking regarding the statement we made that these skills are overlapping and they are integrated, if you've got a low score on listening and it really reflects the behavior of the coach, it's important to be careful not to give high scores on all other skills, because then something is out of sync. Because without listening skills, it's unlikely that you would have high scores across the different skill levels. What is important in listening, and I'm again just emphasizing what comes from the assist team manual, what's important there is, first bullet point is repeating specific words. I remember when I started with ACMC benchmarking, we had lists and lists of words to indicate that people are actually repeating the specific words. Michael's note is clear on that. You do not need to write that down except and unless the person in fact are missing semantically loaded words or are using paraphrases rather than repeating specific words. That change came in when acknowledgements were added to supporting. Because acknowledgements were added, and then that by implication implied repeating specific words. So we don't have to, in fact, keep record of specific words, but we have to be careful that the coach does not create a habit of using his or her own words rather than the client words. Second bullet talks to clarity checks, and in 25 minutes we expect 4 to 7. And as has been stated there, underline in red pen every word the client could have asked about and was not asked. And then once you've got 2 or 3 of those, you subtract another 0.1. And then there's information in terms of things not heard, which is at level 0 or level -1. And you will record what is important and semantically significant. And also, I have found that when I started benchmarking again after some sort of a break, that I ended up writing down things that were more content related than really important from a meaning perspective. If you do that, you actually run the risk. If you just list many words that the client could have asked about, you run the risk of almost teaching. The coach could have asked about you. You run the risk of almost teaching the coach to begin to chase the client's words. And that's where the importance for me comes in. If one say that on things not heard, it has to focus on what is semantically significant. Scoring listening. Listening starts off with a 2.5. So you basically have a 2.5 when you begin to evaluate the evidence that you've got. And from that, you take away what is not present on those critical points that are listed on the benchmarking form on the 2.5, and they are listed here in the text box. Once you've got that, then you add and subtract other evidence, which is then evidence that are above a 2.5, or you subtract evidence that are below a 2.5. For me, important, if you don't meet these basics, even if you have other skills that contribute to that, I would be careful not to actually give a 2.5. Another note there, and this is really just a reminder of part of our earlier discussion, listening and supporting is usually about 0.5 points from each other. And you can, if you're not sure about your listening, for example, you find that listening is higher than supporting and it's more than 0.5 higher, look also at inadequate questions. If you find that there's a number of inadequate questions under questioning, then maybe your listening score is too high. So that takes care of listening, unless there are questions.
Dirk, yes, I have a question. When you were speaking now about not counting the repeated words, because I think, is that taken out of the latest benchmark? Because there used to be once a keywords repeated. Was that taken out?
I said that actually, as I could track it, it was actually taken out when acknowledgements came in. Currently, and on this slide here, it says keywords not repeated is the new formulation. So the words that are repeated, from my perspective, they are there. They are part of acknowledgements because that's really what an acknowledgement is. If they are not there, you will give feedback on the acknowledgements. But here it's really those words that has got value for the client that have not been repeated, or for that matter, where there's been paraphrasing.
Okay, and then just to verify again, because I remember this was one issue you and I discussed in the South African version, is acknowledgements. You do count acknowledgements whether or not the person starts with what I hear you say. Okay, an acknowledgement is simply a statement made in the exact words used of the coachee.
That is how I understand that, and we can check with Michael again. If you read the notes, that you will see that it's stated that I can't remember where specifically it was written, but it says that and the words were, it's also perfectly okay to follow up an acknowledgement with a question, and that sometimes creates more confusion for me to know when it is really an acknowledgement with a specific pause and a question, or whether the acknowledgement forms part of a larger formulation of a question. And I think that's something that I usually watch out for, and I would actually give coaches feedback that if there's not sufficient gap between the acknowledgement and the question, that they have to consider putting in more silence there to allow the client to respond to the acknowledgement before they respond to the question that follows the acknowledgement. So for me, that's more critical than starting off the acknowledgement with, as you've just said, because you still make it an acknowledgement by not looping it to a question.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think one of the things that I just from recent benchmarking that I think that it's quite really good, because I agree with you. You know, you can, you know, a pure acknowledgement, repeating the exact words the client uses even in a phrase, not just the key words, can sometimes have a huge impact. The other thing is, what would you deduct a point? Because I've often sometimes heard people, because now they're thinking they have to acknowledge, they start repeating words the client hears, and it almost sounds like an echo. I mean, what would you do? Would you take away a mark for that, or?
I don't know, and this is where I think my response is it really depends on the specific situation.
Okay.
I can give you an example of what happened very recently in one of the benchmarking sessions I was in, where the coach was repeating words, but he was literally repeating words. So if you say a sentence, he would repeat the last 2 or 3 words, and sometimes it almost sounded like he was finishing sentences, although he didn't. So he would just say 1 or 2 words. Now, for me, that's not an acknowledgement. So I would not count that, but I would not necessarily deduct it. But I would definitely give that person a message, because for me, it's an interpretation of a skill. In that case, it was an interpretation of a skill that he interpreted incorrectly. And when we had a discussion around that, and he understood that the purpose of an acknowledgement is to let the client hear him or herself, specifically in terms of what they have said in the context of the discussion, and then allow the client to reflect on having heard that again. That's the purpose of an acknowledgement. It's not just to repeat words, because he was just repeating words. How you deal with that, I think, depends on the impact it has on the specific coaching conversation.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That was exactly that. Thanks for clearing that up.
Any other questions on listening?
Dirk?
I'm listening.
It's Lee. Just in terms of one of the things that you talked about was the inadequate questions, which indicates the lack of listening. But as we're benchmarking, the other thing that tends to happen, specifically after the new delegates have learned the well-formed outcome, is that they're so focused on asking the well-formed outcome question that they're not hearing the answer to the first question. So that will also, and I know you'll probably touch on that with listening, but also to have the awareness around that. So it's not just about the inadequate questions, but it's almost the inappropriate questions that come to the fore.
Yep. I'm in agreement with you, and And there's a little piece on that in the next slide.
Awesome.
This is if I can get the slide to move on.
Don't break your computer now, Jim.
No, it's happening slowly but surely, and there it comes. Good. So questioning, highlighted piece there says, this is how we coach and facilitate. And exactly the point that Lee made now, or a little bit around that from Michael's document, you as a benchmarker have to ask yourself the following questions. Does the coach use the initial question? Does the coach ask well-formed outcome questions in sequence? And there's been a number of reflections in terms of the inherent logic of the sequence of the well-formed outcome questions. And it doesn't mean that you have to ask them in sequence, but there is some logic if you do ask them in sequence. Does the coach use the outcome frame? Does the coach notice when questions are not answered? And this we've actually picked up often, and I think, Lee, that's also what you referred to. The person has not yet answered question number 4, and they already asked question number 5, because in their minds, they are ticking off the 18 well-formed outcome questions. If the question is not answered, you actually expect the coach to repeat the question. And then the last one, does the coach ask testing questions to confirm that the coach is in fact on the right track with that specific client? What we point out to people is that you really just need 5 well-formed outcome questions in a 25-minute session. And those are 5 specific ones, and they are listed in the documents that has been handed out. So you don't have to ask all 18. And then I shared with the participants in the webinar we had last week, I said that your well-formed outcome questions is for me almost like the structure of a bridge from your present state to your future state. But your bridge also needs pillars, and those pillars are these other questions that you ask, the exploration questions, the testing questions, the checking questions, the clarifying questions. And if you don't prop up your bridge with those questions in addition to the well-formed outcome questions, you will probably find that the bridge will not serve its purpose. The last highlighted area there, also from our team leaders manual, refers to quality control questions. I don't know why that specific sub-skill has been highlighted amongst the others. For me, that is always one that I wonder a little bit about. The definition is relatively easy. For me to pick it up is not that easy. It's different from ecology. Ecology, the way I differentiate between them, ecology deals with how systemically integrated the outcome that the client is pursuing is with the overall client system. In this case, it is, as I read the definition, it's for the coach to check the congruency of the client system. So to see whether how the client operates, in fact, makes sense to the client. And as it's stated there, it might not even make sense to the outside world, but at least they are congruent in their own minds. Questions, you start basically again with a 2.5, and you take away for those questions that have not been asked, which includes the 5 core well-formed outcome questions, and then there's a set of refining questions. And then similar to listening, you add and subtract the other evidence. And what it means is that if they don't ask any questions, they will probably end up with something like a 0.5, because the mandatory questions, if you add them all up, there's basically 20 of them. And you have to have all 20 of those in place to get to a 2.5. And that's not how we calculate it, but it gives you an indication that there's really a very specific requirement in terms of the standard that has to be met for questioning. The last comment on questioning is that day 5 to 7, there's actually a different set of questions to be asked. And that is where we then benchmark not the well-formed outcome frame, but we benchmark the axis of change frame. We haven't really got time tonight to go through that form, but that's something that Michael will definitely spend more time with us, because that's also a form that has changed relatively recently. And I believe that it's actually quite a useful form. And in the past, we've been told that if you do benchmarking after ACMC for people for certification purposes, you could actually choose whether you want to use that form or whether you want to use the well-formed outcome form. And some people in principle say that they are more comfortable with the axis of change format. The only difference is really on the questioning side. And the requirement there is, and there's different numbers that you have to comply with, but then you begin to ask the well-formed outcome questions, the basic ones, that you really focus not so much on the 18 questions, but then on the questions that relate to the different components of the axis of change. If there's no questions, then it is meta questions. Anybody, any input or any questions? I take the silence as no questions. Meta questions, not much input other than to say it has to do with the diamond of consciousness. It has to do with what is the inner world of the client like. And unless you actually explore that in addition to what the client wants, you will probably not get the sustainability in terms of what they're working towards. Important for meta questioning is meta questions must be grounded, they must be relevant, they must be timely. If they don't comply with those requirements, then the reality is that you don't score them. In the guideline, there's a scoring table, and that has actually been done as a result of our difficulty to convert numbers of meta questions to specific scores in Kenya last year, May. You'll see that for both 25-minute session and 35-minute sessions. And how I score meta questions is I count all the meta questions that are there, that are grounded, that are relevant, that are timely, and I just add them up. And then I have a number, and I take the number and I read from the table what score it gives me. If you go beyond 2.5, then it really becomes a matter of saying how much do you believe those questions have really contributed to the overall process, and you might go then to a 2.6, 2.7, 2.8, whatever you believe that is. Two notes here is, remember that the well-formed outcome questions contain at least that numbers of meta questions that I've listed there: 3, 9, 10, 15, 16, 3B if you repeat the question, is it still compelling, and then 17 decision and 18 evidence. So all of those are meta questions. So if the person asks those questions as part of questioning, you can count them again, if I can put it like that, under meta questions. Another thing that worked for me was to say, do I know what meta questions are in fact relevant, or what questions are meta questions? And we often found in the past in benchmarking that benchmarkers miss meta questions because they don't recognize them as meta questions. And perhaps a simplistic way to deal with that, but one that worked for me, is to at least have those 10 meta questions that we tell coaches to learn by heart, to have them in your mind and say, okay, these are the 10 that I should look for, because these are most probably the 10 that coaches will begin to use. And you will remember them. That's metaphor, value, intention, identity, permissions, prohibitions, believe, remember, imagine, decide, and expect. And those are the 10 that they're told in the training. They're in the manual. Go learn them. Go try them out initially. And that would be a recommendation from my side, because those are probably the ones that if they consciously and intentionally begin to use, that they will put into their coaching sessions, And if you miss those, you miss an opportunity to reinforce behavior which they're actually working on. Does anybody have a meaningful meta question?
Do we have a meaningful meta question for you?
No, a meta question.
Oh, okay. I heard meta question.
I have enough of my own. Yeah, I have enough of my own.
Yes, I
can give you some if you want.
I think there's no questions, Dirk, so please do go on.
Right, so feedback, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the two feedback scores. I just want to, Lee, I just want to hold the frame about feedback and development. How do you like that for holding the frame? Feedback for me is
so what's important about that?
Say again?
What's important about that for you?
Thank you. Now we're getting somewhere. The importance for me, and I would gladly answer that, is that I really think we underemphasize the value of a proper learning plan for coaches in training. But we'll talk a lot about that next week. So if we look at, go back to the initial frame that I said benchmarking is about developmental planning. If that is true, then feedback for me is the developmental conversation. This is where the conversation takes place. And it would usually go something like this. It would be, Coach, what are you working on? Which behaviors, and this is really the emphasis on the development plan. What have you got in your development plan that in this session you're going to focus on? Then, during the session, after the session, you will tell the person which skills you've actually observed that have been demonstrated. That was one of the big learnings from the last ACMC that I picked up. And that is really the emphasis on giving people feedback on the competencies that are already there, so that they know what they can build on. So tell people that. Then saying to them that the skills that I've seen and what you've demonstrated, here's how they compare to the standard. In other words, the skills that I've seen, they are on a level 2.5 or a 2.0 or whichever level it is. And then conclude, and this is part of how we are taught to give feedback, but I also find that that often gets neglected, and I'm talking about myself, because you get so engrossed in giving feedback on some of the other details that you run out of time. And the piece that you have to, in fact, give as a parting gift to the coaches to say, and what you can work on in future is this, this, and that. So yes, you want to put it as a challenge, or if you want to put it as a strength that the person can use more, or if this is the leverage point that will really take your skills to the next level, or here's the one thing in the whole discussion that if you change that, it will actually take some of the other skills with as well. And I think we've started using feed forward much earlier than what other coaches started writing about that, because that's how I understand feed forward. As you say to the person that next time you do this, if you do X, Y, and Z, it might actually just take you to the skills that you want to achieve. So very briefly on giving feedback and receiving feedback, and then if there's questions on feedback, we can take those. Both of them in my mind is to understand what the baseline is. In terms of giving feedback, excuse me, the baseline score for me there, has the person in fact mentioned 2 sensory-based facts every 2 minutes? So for a 5-minute session, 5-minute feedback session, you look for 10 facts. Has the person used the numbers, the levels on which they had to give feedback? Did they do it with rapport, and did they make their feedback tentative? If they've done all of that, it's a 2.5. If they haven't done this, you do not, in my mind, give a 2.5, because this is such a key piece of feedback to development that you have to be specific in terms of the required behavior. And I also have to just correct myself. You don't give point 2.5. Then the score does not relate to the 2.5 level. Receiving feedback, the other side of the coin. Once again, if the person has got any behavior below the 2.5, in my opinion, it actually detracts from silent reflection, acknowledgement, and a neutral state of mind. So where the person begins to argue around specific points, where they begin to explain why they did certain things, all of that, in my mind, says it's not on the level of silent reflection and acknowledgement, and would imply that that behavior would not be similar to the standard for a 2.5. I don't know if anybody wants to add any information on giving or receiving feedback, or ask any questions.
Just up front, didn't you mentioning that when you're giving feedback, the importance of perhaps the framing? Because I find that quite useful when you frame what the feedback session. Is that something you'd look at?
You know that, and I fully agree with you that it is extremely important. What I often do, and this is really just a practicality, in the triad, when I give feedback the first time, I would actually frame it for everybody. So I won't necessarily frame it every time. So when there's usually a little bit of time before the session starts, hopefully everybody is there. Then I'll say, can I just frame for all of you how this works? And then that there's actually a section in the team leader's manual that almost gives it to you word for word. Where you start off, I'm your consultant. So I might interrupt you, you might stop me, ask me. That's the pre-framing as your role of a benchmarker. And then when you begin to give feedback, I would spend a bit more time with the first person in the triad to say, and make sure that the other people actually follow what I'm saying, and say then, here's, and even sometimes comment on what I'm doing. So I would say to people, I have this approach to giving feedback. In my mind, I've got this little rhyme that says, with rapport and with permission. So the first thing I would do is I would check that I'm, at least in terms of my posture, in rapport with the person I'm giving feedback to. And the normal question is, are you ready to get some feedback? And then frame whatever else needs to be framed, in the sense that what I've observed today is applicable in this session with this client as I've observed it. And I might have missed certain pieces of behavior, but I'm giving you what I've seen. And that for me is the framing that I do. And then with the next person, I might not be as particular to actually, again, do the pre-framing and the framing just before the feedback, because it has already been told to that specific group. I don't know if that adds to what you're saying, or whether you want to add some more.
Well, yes, just maybe. Well, I'm just thinking in terms of benchmarking someone giving feedback. Would you not expect them to actually frame before they give the feedback? So, to me, that's quite important.
No, I would agree with you, and I would expect them to frame it similarly to I do. But I would be very interested to hear what frames you would really want them to share with. You're talking now the meta person giving feedback to the coach.
Yes, because that's who you would be benchmarking on giving feedback, yes. Right?
So what frames would you, for example, be looking for?
No, I think the ones that the ones you mentioned, in terms of, you know, first of all, to actually not just start giving the person, so as you mentioned in rapport, but, you know, basically saying, are you ready to accept my observations, and I will be giving you observations on exactly what you said. But I wouldn't say that that's something you only do with once. I would expect that every person that you're benchmarking does do that, in terms when you are benchmarking them for giving feedback. Or is that sort of, am I understanding?
I'm in full agreement with you. Okay. I didn't mean to say that you say that once and then never again.
So no, I just wanted to clear that, because I don't know why. I'm just trying to find my formula. I think it was, I'm not sure if it is in the feedback sheet. That's actually what I'm trying to look here. No, it's not. It's not really in the feedback sheet. It's not on the form. But I mean, I would actually give somebody, when I'm scoring, if they don't do that, that's what I'm saying. If you benchmarking someone and they don't do that, I wouldn't give them a 2.5. So that's what I'm trying to say. But even though that specific point is not on the benchmark sheet, is it?
I would say that you can't really be tentative about feedback unless you frame it. For me, that would be the link with framing. You have to put it into context.
Yes.
Which is different from saying, I am the super benchmarker or the super meta person. I have now seen where you're at, and I'm going to translate that to you into scores. And that's really the function of framing it for me would be to actually put that into perspective. And that I would look at for that under tentative, making it tentative.
Okay.
Sandra, I see in the benchmark manual under with rapport, they speak of matching, giving permission to give feedback, setting the frame with the purpose of feedback, that the purpose of feedback is to support, etc.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's under rapport basically. You calculate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Lee.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
State induction. The three ideas that I took from the Team Leaders Manual, firstly, in effective coaching, the coach communicates in a way so that the client emotionally experiences the meanings being discussed. If we say that meta coaching is experiential coaching, and there's no state inductions, then in my mind it's not experiential coaching. Then it's a conversation or an intellectual discussion about something that the client has only in their heads and not necessarily in their bodies. And that's how I frame it for myself, to say to myself, there is an important component of meta coaching that says that you have to get to the emotion of the client to be successful. The next point there is, what do you want a client to experience? And then this talks to, in my mind, to being careful not to induce the wrong states. Because what you want the client to focus on is curiosity, exploration, learning, trust, decisions, focused attention, and whatever else will actually take that client to the outcome. The key to state induction benchmarking for me is to see what the coach is doing that induces, evokes, and elicits the client's experience. Now, we have interesting discussions around state inductions often in ACMCs. And if I say that you run the risk of having just an intellectual conversation, I think the key to be able to introduce the emotions to the coaching situation is if you know how to do it for yourself. And I have picked up a document, I think it was could have been about a year ago, that Jason Snyder from the US, I know him, we did our NSTT together. He has put that together and he calls it the meta stage toolbox, and you might have seen that. If not, we can make it available to you. And what it is, it's his way of taking all the different meta states that are in the APG or Coaching Genius manual and saying, here's perhaps a way in which you can build your own states. Be that a coaching state, be that a feedback state, be that a selling state, whichever state you're looking for. And it's almost like saying, here's different components. And some of the components that he's got in there are the typical ones from APG or Coaching Genius, like acceptance, like permission, like the confirmation, the yes, the no, the disconfirmation, the just observing state. The point I want to make is that if you personally have got access to a number of states and see these states that I've read to you now as states that you probably should have access to, the question is, how readily can you access those? And do you know what to do to get there? Because if you can't do it for yourself, I'm not so sure that you will necessarily pick it up if the coach does it for the client. You would probably, but it would be easier. And then he gives you a template, and he says that the 3 things that he fills in, and there's even examples of that, the 3 things he fills in to make it easy for him to have these states and access them. First, what's the reference experience or the movie in the mind? So one can ask the question, what does the client experience, or what is the coach doing to get the client to a reference experience, to get the client to really access a movie in his mind? Secondly, Jason's form says, for that reference experience or for that movie in my mind, which might be remembered or imagined, as you know, what's the physiology of that? What's the breathing of that? What's the gestures that go with that? What's my internal dialogue with that? What's my external dialogue with that? And these are the things that the coach might actually be doing in terms of getting the client to access those specific components of a state. And lastly, there's a component that says, and how do I trigger or anchor that? How can I access that? And you can use anything from an image to a sound to a metaphor. Again, physiology. And the difference between just doing it in an NLP context and doing it in a meta-coaching context is really that you do it conversationally. But those are the things that for me begins to indicate that that coach is very specifically busy with state induction. If one then go to how you score that, if there's a requirement for 2 to 5 relevant states induced by voice and content, I would look for states that I can really, it's almost like you have another person next to you, and when you point out that state induction, you say, there the coach is doing something to get that state for the client, to help that client towards the well-formed outcome through curiosity, through decision making, through exploration, or whichever one of those key components the coach is aiming at. And that's the baseline that I would determine and say, has the person got 2 to 5? In some of the other documents, the number 3 also comes up, so I guess that's probably the sort of midpoint that you're looking for. And if you then read through the other notes regarding this state induction, one of the other points that I made there is when this state is induced, and it is not with a congruent voice and gestures, you deduct the 0.1 for every state that is induced. And then if you have a look at these components here, it says that if you identify some of these states that were induced, but they were only induced by the questions that the coach asked, you can give the coach a, let me rephrase that, you can actually for each of those allocate a 0.1, even though there's no voice or gestures, but purely because they have been induced as part of the discussion. And those are the other components that I would then add more intentionally or deduct more intentionally, because that would give you an opportunity to say the voice and congruent voice and gestures was not there, and therefore you deduct those, even though the person might have the relevant number, and then credit for these states, even though there's no voice and gestures, but they were induced purely. And this is where we find that if you ask the right questions and meta questions, then you will induce some of these states. But they don't, in my mind, count towards those that are intentionally induced by the state, by the client. Let me repeat, by the coach for the client. Questions around state induction or anything else at this stage?
Dirk, sorry, yes. One question on what you've just said, though, although I understand and agree that meta questions don't automatically induce state, am I right in saying, though, that if the meta questions asked and you can very easily tell by the rolling of the eyes and the silence that the person has gone into a state, that you could give that does count as a state on inducing state?
For me, there's I think most of the states that will be induced by a question or a meta question. So for me, there's almost a way of thinking that says that's always how you induce a specific state. I always also say to myself that you're never not in a state. So every question, in fact, either emphasizes a state that you're already in or begin to shift you to a next state. So there's a continuous ebb and flow of states in the coaching discussion that takes place. For me, the question is, when do I begin to say that the coach is using state induction as a tool in his toolbox? And I would also acknowledge that as the coach becomes more experienced, you might not pick it up as easily. So it might be purely conversational, and those states might just happen. But you will, in fact, see the change in the physiology of the client, which is a pure or a state induction that I would count as one of those minimum ones, would actually be a state that the client goes into. It's not just a brief accessing of a state, and I'm now putting words in your mouth. It's not just quickly the flash of the eyes and you see there's an acknowledgement of something. It's actually where there's a change in the physiology and the emotion of the client, and it is utilized by the coach. And this is really, I think, where we get into a situation where it's very difficult to, for me at least, to explain that without being in a practical situation to say, here's an example and there's an example, because it is not, for me, that simple to put words to that distinction. If I'm in doubt, and I'm of the opinion that the state was induced and it was useful, I would rather err on the side of giving the coach credit than to be too strict and keep it away. Because it's an opportunity to say, when you did X, Y, and Z, this is what happened for the client, and here's where that specific piece of the coaching session took the conversation following that question, intervention, whatever happened there. So it's a bit of a roundabout way to say that it's really your take on what has happened and to what extent you can actually relate to that one sentence in Michael's document that says, what has the coach actively done? And then relate that to the other one that says, if there was a link to a state that was really just as a result of the question, you still give credit. But you want the coach, in my view, to intentionally induce states as part of his facilitation of that client's outcome. I don't know whether I've answered it, but I've spoken about it. I don't know if anybody else can add some information. I'm sure there's lots of wisdom.
Just on that point, for clarity in terms of when you're benchmarking someone in inducing state, I agree everything you're saying. And if you look at the form, the coaching the body, the voice inflection, the inducing is actually at a 3.5 level. So if you're going to benchmark on a 2.5, my question is, as you said, the meta questions are the way to get into the inducing state. In terms of benchmarking, am I right in saying we'd listen for that and then look at the client in terms of how the intensity, and that's where you'd rate your intensity. But at a 2.5, you're looking at 2 to 5 states that the person can induce. What would you recommend in terms of the intensity for you to count that as a state for the 2.5?
It's one of those questions where I'm not sure that a recommendation would necessarily be useful. I actually had a slide previously which said that it needs to be sort of around a 3 or a 4 or at least beyond a 5 before you begin to recognize that. Now the challenge with that is, what is a 3 for you and what's a 3 for me? Because that is by virtue of us just allocating numbers to it, it becomes extremely subjective. So for me, your calibration of state changes in terms of intensity will probably, in any event, be relative to your own map of the world and to what you believe state should be. So I would suggest that you really, for yourself, ask the question, if you take all of this as a integrated package of sub-skills and say that the person has in fact done something specifically, and he has used his voice or she has used their gestures, and they have in fact done some of the others where they've done some gauging questions, and they ask them, out of a 10, where are you? What do you need to do to increase that? They've used induction language. They've given a menu list. So as you begin to add those, you will probably find that the intensity goes up. If the intensity is really very low, then I don't know whether one can count it. If the intensity is sufficient that the client, in fact, respond in terms of the progression of the coaching session on that specific state, then it's sufficient. And what your number is, I'm not sure that that's that critical, as long as there's relevance. And as I think one continues to benchmark, you will find most probably that those are the states that you give the higher scores in terms of the intensity in any event. Okay. I haven't answered your question. You want a specific answer? No. It's around about 4 at least.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. No, I think just to, for a second, Dirk, because I think as I'm listening to all of this, and I'm just to share my personal experience, and this is just my personal experience, when you are benchmarking for the first time. So I think obviously at the moment, I know Cindy is there, and I know, and Lee, of course, has done benchmarking. Paul, I'm sure, has done benchmarking as well. So it could not be the same experience, but I know that sometimes it can be quite overwhelming as a benchmarker to try and track everything. And I felt from my experience was that because you're on day 1 and 2, you're focusing a lot more on listening and supporting, and then you're moving on to meta questions and questions towards the second half of the ACMC, and that's just my personal experience. You then tend to sort of, as a benchmarker, listen deeper for the inducing states. And that's where, for me, it was quite difficult, because you sort of not sure on a 2.5. You've heard a lot of improvements by then as well from your participants. You can see that there's improving in terms of how they're asking the meta questions and using the voice. And your benchmarking, actually, my benchmarking changed a little bit along the way, when by the last few days I was listening a lot more for the inducing state and listening a lot more for the voice and the draw and the inflection. So I don't know if that's just what would you comment on that for possibly some new benchmarkers who haven't had a lot of experience in doing that?
My comment would be it gets better as the time goes by. Because that's really what it is. What one can do, I think, to accelerate that a bit is to, and we, I think, have the luxury of having 1 or 2 additional people in Mauritius next week, is to share notes. And with that I mean that where there's somebody that hasn't got a specific triad at a specific point in time, to sit with each other and have an understanding of how the other person sees and then specifically let's talk state induction, what they've picked up, why they have maybe states that you have seen, why they haven't given the credit for that state that you would have. And sometimes it's just because they don't observe that. They haven't seen that, and that's how we operate, because we look for things that suit our maps. But that would be, I think, you firstly, as you get more practice, and the ACMC is a wonderful opportunity to have condensed practice, your benchmarking definitely increases over the days. So that will become easier. And secondly, as I've said, make use of your colleagues. And it doesn't mean that the person with the most assist teams behind them are the person that will be the best in state induction or picking up state induction. Sometimes it's just the person that actually has that that eye, and they pick it up in a different way because their mindsets are more tuned for state induction. So anybody can actually teach you a heck of a lot in terms of what you miss in specific sessions. So that would be one of the things that I would also recommend that, and that I would want to use is to actually compare notes with people and see what they have seen. And if initially there's a gap in terms of how we allocate specific marks to the behavior that we've seen, so much the better, because I think that will really trigger the discussions. And then there's an opportunity, and maybe we should even structure that, is to really make time to sit and learn from Michael. He is very generous with sharing knowledge. He's very generous with his time. And if we've got any issues with any of these, let's schedule a session where we sit with Michael and observe how he does it. And he can even give us some feedback on how we do it. Because that's really the opportunity that we have next week, and that's to learn. And then when you're back from that ACMC is to continue practicing, because that's the challenge for many people who do not benchmark regularly, because then you lose it. You have to start again in a way. But thank you very much for that point, Sandra. I think it is extremely relevant.
Because I think, thank you for that, because I think what you've just said now is really important, and I'd like, for you to also assist us with that in your role, is for that, because I found, just from my experience in the last two bench team leaders that I have been, that part was missing. Everyone is so busy, and there's so much to do in the ACMC. There's a lot of things on the team leaders' minds as well, but I think that if we can try and get that right, to be there for that extra conversation, the extra support, the extra assistance as a team to help each other, I think will make a big difference. For example, just on that inducing state, one of the easy things that helped me, because that was one area that I was struggling, is I would purposely listen. Every time I'd mark a meta question, I'd write the word or the state that meta question would be most likely to induce, write it down, and immediately look at the client and say, watch them, how's their face, how they react, how are they induced, are they not induced? And that would help me, because at least in giving feedback, I found that helpful to say, although you asked 20 or 5 meta questions, and I noticed these states induced by the client, but this is, and I think that helped me, because in terms of the giving the amount of feedback. But anyway, having, like you said, those type of discussions, I don't know how much time we will have during those weeks, but I think that will be quite helpful, and we can try and get, I don't know, every now and then a few, even if it's at night with a glass of wine or something, that we can get to do that.
I would just like to share a personal experience, and that is, I often thought that you really have to have a very intensive discussion to learn. And I had the privilege of being at an ACMC where we had a sort of a roaming super coach walking around, giving us this sort of feedback and inputs. And the magic of just that one sentence, 2 sentence exchanges. And I don't think we should ever underestimate that.
Yeah.
It's really those things, and I don't think we should not have the lengthy discussions. We should have those, but we should also not think that 1 minute, that one sentence hasn't got the value. It has. So share that when you walk past a person, when you have the 2 minutes whilst groups are switching. For me, that was really a revelation in terms of how much that contributed.
Definitely. Thanks, Dirk.
Right. So what has happened now is we've really come to the end of the section that is the more I don't want to call it academic input, but that's probably what it is. They're talking about the concepts, and there's an opportunity now to look at 1 or 2. I don't want to call it case studies, but a form that has got some marks on it and say how we can score that. Time-wise, not from when we were supposed to start, but from where we started, we have about 7 minutes left. So I'm not so sure that it's going to be useful to really engage in this discussion. But what we could perhaps do is just pick one of the skills and say, let's just see whether this concept of how I've put it together work. That would be useful for me if it's fine with you. Use about 3 or 4 minutes for that, and then the rest of the time to conclude. That would be my suggestion for going forward. If nobody objects or has any others, then that will be it. I'll give you a silence of 10 seconds to respond. Which means this is how we go forward. The question is there any one of those skills that you would like us to specifically focus on? If you're not picking one, I'm picking an easy one.
Go for it.
Okay. I'm going then with, and I have to say that this concept comes from David Murphy. He has sent out a document some time ago. And what I've done, and we can make these slides available, but what I've done is I've just said, if your scoring form would look like this, what would you give as the score? So in this specific case, and we are busy here with supporting, what has been scored here is 5 acknowledgements, and as you know, you don't have to write down all 5 examples, you just need some examples so that you can give proper feedback. There's 5 acknowledgements, there's 2 frames that were set in the beginning, and there's a frame example written down. There's 1 confrontation, but this was really a good confrontation. There's only 1, but qualitatively it counts for 2. And there was 1 summary, which was an ordinary summary. And there's an example of that. Then there were 2 examples of semantic matches. There was a note regarding one that was missed. And then the person also mimicked, in other words, just did whatever the client did for a short period of time. Energy, the assessment was that the energy of the client and the coach was sufficiently correlated to say that there was a match. And in David's original document, it says it should be 1 point apart only. If you go to anything that's 2 points or more, then it means it's not matched. So all the others were there, and then that one was not there. And there was also some fidgeting by the coach. So if you have this configuration of evidence, what's the score?
1.7 minus 1, 2, 3.
So there's my answer.
Yes, 1.5.
So you have a 1.4, I have a 1.5. I think we are spot on. And this would be a way, I think, if we want to compare notes, is you don't have to have this form set up like this, but if we all take care to really indicate our evidence in terms of the tick marks, then it's also easy to sit with a person and say, can we have that discussion that I've just referred to? And due to the time, I think that we should now conclude this session. So I only have one last thing, and that is to ask you for some feedback and ask you if there's anything else that we can assist with before we meet next week. And some of you will meet Monday night. I think some of us from South Africa might actually miss the dinner because we might arrive too late. We might just have time to have some sort of liqueur or something with you afterwards. I hope to put a few notes together with regards to the questions that we would use for the access of change benchmarking. I'm having a session after this session with Femke to just give me some input, and it's not that I don't trust Michael. I'm sure he will give us adequate input, but it sometimes helps if you just have a bit of a frame before the time to ask better questions. So that's what I'll do with that, Sandra. I'll write it up, send it to you, and if you can just distribute it to everybody, it would really be the first input into my guideline document with regards to questioning for access of change benchmarking.
Fantastic.
And with that, I'm done. If anybody else has got anything else to ask or to say, there's a minute left.
Well, Dirk, nobody has had any questions because I've typed that on the message and I haven't seen anything replied. Could maybe for a last minute, you did this one so quick, I'm sure you could, why don't you do one more of these examples?
You are a hard taskmaster.
Just one more. Come on, go for it.
Okay, there's listening.
Okay.
So the evidence on this one is we said that if we start with listening, the person really starts with the 2.5, and you have to ask the question, what has happened under the 2.5 required skills? You're looking for 4 to 7 clarity check of words. Here's examples of 2 clarity checks that were made and 2 that the person actually missed. So what you have is a credit for 2 and negative for 2. So that's the clarity check of words that I have observed in this session. There were 2 silences, and for those of you that haven't been to ACMCs for some time, silence used to be a level 3 benchmark. It's now 2.5, so you're actually looking for that. And this person has the habit of, every time they ask a question, to look down on their well-formed outcome list of questions, or they stare into the distance to formulate their question. So their eye contact wasn't what it should be. This person had, in fact, asked the person to listen back to what they've said, so there was a bit of an inviting of awareness. And 2 things not heard were recorded, and you will remember that we said that's for each of those it's minus 0.2. And there was 1 example of mind reading. In terms of the acknowledgements, the encourages here on this side, it's hidden by the GoToMeeting control panel here, but they were sort of in order. So the question for this one is, what would your score be?
So I would say 1.7.
I have no clue what I said, so let's see. But why only you? Anybody else wants to offer a score?
No one else is talking. Cynthia, what's happening? Paul? I know Lee's there. Oh, you know what?
So my score is a bit higher than yours.
Oh, what did I miss?
I don't know. It's probably something I missed. So let me share with you how I actually got to that. Firstly, it can't be a 2.5, and I think we agree on that, because the person has missed here. There's not 4, there's only 2. So I would start off by saying, if it was a 2.5, I would take away that 2 that the person has missed. I would take away that 1, which takes it to a 2.2. I would then say that's basically where I start off from. And if it's a 2.2, I would say here's another 4 that goes away, so it's a 1.8, 1.7, and then there's 3 that gets added back, which makes it a 2, and this is how I would do it.
Oh, why did you add it back?
Because that's positive evidence.
Oh, okay.
I haven't given the person credit yet for silence, the 2 silences, or for the inviting the awareness. I've based my 2.5 to a very large extent on not making the clarity word of checks and not making the eye contact.
Okay, so my understanding was that silence would be part of the...
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Yeah, it is. But as I said, for listening, the way I look at that is you really start with a 2.5 and you take away.
So then you take away, but then you don't add it back.
Yeah, maybe you're right there.
I don't know, hey?
So
I'm just asking. Because,
let me just say those were two very good silences.
okay, okay.
But if you then say, and I think this is really the wonderful thing about benchmarking, because out of context it becomes relatively difficult, and the only thing that you can look at is your scoring, and you're probably closer to the score that would fit this profile than mine. So yours was 1.7,
Yes.
so it's probably between 1.7 and 2.
Probably 1.8, because I agree with you. I didn't count the invite awareness.
Yeah, yeah. So if you, and that's the other point that's critical, is if you think in terms of benchmarking and you are within 0.2 from each other, I think that's fine.
Okay, yes.
You don't have to be too concerned that you have to be exactly at the right point, because you will not be exactly at the right point because you don't hear everything. But if you begin to deviate and you are 0.5 difference from another person, then there's a discussion required between those two people, because you have to align and see who actually listens differently to the evidence or applies their minds in a different way in terms of converting the evidence that they've got to a specific evaluation of that evidence against the standard. So this was a great one. I think that if I have to do this specific one again, and I'll do this before we distribute the slides, we'll make it 1.8.
Okay.
Because the two silences already adds up to the 2.5 not being reduced by even more.
But I suppose,
I'll
you know,
probably make it 1.9, because one silence would actually say it's fine. And then give him credit for one more. But this is not nitpicking. And I think we have to conclude, because I have to prepare for my next session.
Okay, so thank you. Cynthia, just quickly, I just wanted to say I noticed your mute was actually muted by me. Yeah, so you weren't able to talk. Are you okay? Would you like to just say something quickly?
Me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Sorry, we weren't able. Welcome. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. But just tonight, I returned Hong Kong from a flight, from a trip, so I was just mentally just half present. Okay, I have to listen back to the recording.
Okay. Okay.
Cynthia, Dirk, if I may say, if I read the note that you've written, I think you were fully present. I mean, if you agree with it too, then you are really spot on. Please take notes, Sandra.
Okay. Yeah. Michael counts as one, I think. I mean, one for each silence, right?
Yeah.
I remember. Yeah, so that's why I agree for it.
Yeah. No, thank you. I will definitely sit next to you when we do the training with Michael, because I know I have support at least in one other team member.
Okay.
Okay, from my side, everybody, thank you so much for listening, and I really would appreciate feedback. If you have got any ideas that you want to just give to me in private, I'll really appreciate that, or you can tell me next week. And then, other than that, see you next week. Looking forward to that. Thanks for making this possible, Sandra.
Yes, thank you very much. Just finally say thank you for all your preparations as usual. It was really helpful, and I'm sure everybody appreciates it. And everyone that will listen in the recording as well will appreciate. Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was really useful to have this review again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Dirk, and enjoy your session with Femke, and looking forward to seeing you all in Mauritius.
Great.
Thanks. See you next week.
Great. Okay, goodbye, everyone. Bye.